Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Joel Brandt. It was a great introduction, David, and I'll admit that I am in a little bit of a situation of having imposter syndrome here. It's great to be among so many people that have contributed so much more than I have to open source. So thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. So this is by far the most successful open source project I've been involved in, Brackets. I know lots of you in here actually contributed and participated in Brackets, probably more than I did. And the reason I put this up here is I bet that for lots and lots of you, the first thing you did when you saw this slide is you looked up here in the corner to these numbers, right? This is a thing we do all the time with open source projects. We want to know how big they are. We want to know how many people are contributing. You know, if we're involved in an open source project, we really want to make these numbers rise, and this makes us feel great, right? Just a little shot of endorphins every time we see these numbers go up. And the numbers are great for Brackets. I had very little to do with getting those numbers up there. I think maybe Adam Lehman's here today, and you know, incredible amount of credit goes to him and the rest of the development team. But I would say that per amount of time I've invested in it, there's this other open source project that has paid much, much bigger dividends for me. And this is a little project that I worked on with an intern who is a PhD student at the Media Lab. It's hosted at the Media Lab, as you can see. You can see that it's got a whopping 4 contributors to it. And you know, there's 12 people watching it. Not a big deal. Certainly not changing the world in terms of how software is built or what software engineers use to build on top of and things like that. But the fact that this is an open source project has been incredibly beneficial to me for the amount of time it's taken for me to, you know, cultivate this enormous open source community. And that's really what I want to focus on today. You know, I know that I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here because everybody in this room is super excited about open source, and lots of you are already involved in it. But what I want to talk about is that open source and your open source projects don't have to be big in order for them to be great. And this really ties into David's point of open source as a lifestyle, not a license. There's a lot you can do on top of open source to make your life better and the lives better of those that are contributing just by participating in this community. So my talk will be pretty quick today. What I want to do is talk about some reasons that I think small open source projects can be great, and hopefully give you some, you know, fodder to use whenever you're trying to convince somebody that you should have a small open source project, or convince somebody else that they should, you know, do that small project they're doing as open source. And then I'll talk at the very end about some pitfalls that I think we need to make sure and avoid. So to give you a tiny bit of my background, I'm in Adobe Research, and I'm the Director of Research Engineering for the Creative Technologies Lab, which is David Salazin's organization. Now, I'll admit that I come from an incredibly privileged position in terms of doing open source work here at Adobe, because I have a VP who's incredibly supportive, and I'm in an organization where everybody chooses their own projects and decides what they want to work on. So basically, I can start an open source project anytime I want, which is very different than I know that the position that a lot of you are in. So I realize I'm coming at this from a privileged position, but I think hopefully with some of the things I have to say, you know, you can make better arguments for why the thing you're doing ought to be open source. So, you know, when you think about open source, we always think about collaboration. But I really want to start off by emphasizing this point. It's an incredibly powerful tool for collaboration. Starting a project from the very beginning as open source really can help move collaboration forward. And that's because it clarifies the intentions of all participants. So this is something that we face all the time in research. We want to start external collaborations with universities. You guys may or may not know this, but in CTL, for example, there are about 40 people, and every year we have close to 80 interns. So we have a huge intern program. Most of them are PhD level interns, and we collaborate with people on their PhD thesis projects. And that's actually how lots and lots of the work at Adobe Research gets done. You know, all the great things that you think of from Adobe Research, Content-Aware Fill, Warp Stabilizer, MorphCut, all of these were collaborations with universities. And many of our university collaborations we do as open source. We just start them from day one as open source. And what's really great about this is universities often worry about collaborating with industry because they worry that they want to just you know, use the university's resources to generate IP. And as soon as you say, hey, we're going to do this as open source, it immediately clarifies the intentions of every party. We want to build great stuff with you. We want it to be out there in the world, And let's talk about how we can make something great rather than get lost in legal arguments about how we can divide up the IP. So, the moment in Adobe Research that we say, hey, let's do this as open source, it just makes collaboration go so much simpler. And this is something that I think can even really pay big dividends for internal open source, the sort of one-star thing that David alluded to. I don't want to imply that Adobe is an organization where lots of people are trying to get credit for the work they do, but sometimes people are, right? And volunteering to go fix a bug in product X or product Y, if we don't have an internal open source model where there's a strong community of fixing bugs in each other's code and things like that, then it's less clear how you'll get credit for it. And so by really embracing this this notion of internal open source, even, it can really clarify the intentions of all the parties involved. Another thing that a lot of people worry about, and a lot of managers worry about when their reports talk about wanting to do something open source, is that there's going to need to be a lot of overhead in writing better code and writing code that you're okay with the world seeing. And I think, not to make any deeper point than the point on this slide, I think it should be pretty clear when phrased this way. Having it be that you need to write code that you're okay with the world seeing is probably a good bar for all the code you write anyway. And so there really actually, I don't think, is any cost to doing any extra cost to doing development that you'd be okay with being open source over the code you'd write anyway. The other thing I'd like to say is that, and I showed one of my reports this slide as I was putting it together, is that David was very great in showing all these huge successes that Adobe Research has had, in creating huge communities around particular projects we've worked on. And I don't want to minimize that at all. I think it's fantastic that we keep doing that. But there can also be incredibly small open source projects that we don't publicize widely, that we don't advertise, maybe that we don't brand in any way with Adobe, or that we have other ways of sort of branding. So we have an Adobe Research organization on GitHub. You've maybe never seen it. That's kind of by design, where we can host small projects that are initial collaborations, and there's branding around them that implies that they are, PhD projects and things like that, and aren't meant to be widely adopted, broadly applicable open source projects. And so for all of these things, there's very little effort put into community management and things like that. Now, I don't want to imply that you should never do that. And, lots of the time, community management is hugely important, and you get huge bang for the buck. But if you just have an open source project where it's really about two people from two organizations collaborating, you won't get fired for not putting in the effort to build great edifices around this. It's okay. And going along with what I said, something being open source doesn't mean that it has to have a community, doesn't mean that it has to be advertised, doesn't mean that it needs to be this huge vehicle. We want those things sometimes, but we don't need them all the time. And if you take this away from sort of the burden of open source, I think it really can help you think more broadly about why you might want to embrace open source for the thing you're doing. The other thing is, a lot of people think of these huge open source projects we have, like Brackets, as incredibly useful for recruiting. And I agree, they are. I'm very glad that we have them for that purpose. But I've also found in my own experience that having these small projects that really nobody knows about are useful for targeted recruiting, for actually convincing people to accept job offers. So, many times we've been trying to hire a researcher, and we've made the offer to them, and we want to show them some of the neat work we're doing. If work is open source, you can simply point, some prospective candidate to that work and say, hey, let's talk about this. Look at this thing I'm building. Let me show you something deep and interesting